The chandelier above the grand foyer scattered gold light across the marble floor, and for one heartbeat, Sophia Renard believed the crash she heard was thunder outside. It was not thunder. It was her own body hitting the front steps of the mansion she had called home for 4 years, her white gown twisted beneath her, rain already soaking through the silk, and the man standing over her was not a stranger with a knife or a burglar in the dark. He was her husband. He was smiling. Nathaniel Cole had never raised a hand to her in public before that night. He had perfected other weapons, silence that lasted for days, a signature withheld on a hospital form, a credit card cancelled without warning the week she needed her prenatal vitamins refilled. But cruelty, like anything else in Nathaniel's world, eventually needed an audience, and that night he had one. 200 guests stood frozen in the ballroom behind him, champagne flutes suspended halfway to their lips, watching their host shove his 8 months pregnant wife down the front steps of his own estate as casually as a man flicking ash from a cigarette. "Get up," Nathaniel said, and his voice carried the particular boredom of a man who found even his own violence tedious. "Or should I have the staff carry you out like garbage? It would honestly be an upgrade for you." Sophia's palms scraped against wet stone as she pushed herself upright, one arm locked instinctively around the curve of her belly, feeling her son twist in fright beneath her ribs. Above her, at the top of the marble staircase, a woman in a dress the color of a fresh wound leaned against the banister with her arms crossed, watching the scene with the satisfaction of someone who had spent months waiting for this exact moment. Isabelle Douard did not bother hiding her smile. She had never needed to. For the better part of a year, she had been Nathaniel's mistress in every sense but the legal one, and tonight, apparently, was the night he intended to make it official in front of witnesses. "Nathaniel," Sophia said, and her voice shook despite every effort to steady it, "I'm carrying your son." "You're carrying a mistake," he corrected her, descending 2 steps so the crowd could hear every syllable. "A mistake I'm done paying for. My lawyers will contact you about the divorce terms. Until then, get off my property before I have you removed like the trespasser you now are." Somewhere in the ballroom, a woman gasped. No one moved to help her. That was the detail Sophia would remember longest, longer even than the pain radiating up her spine, longer than the rain soaking through white silk until it clung to her skin like a shroud. 200 people who had eaten at her table, who had called themselves her friends, and not a single one of them crossed the threshold to lift her from the ground. She had no phone. It sat inside on the table beside a champagne glass she'd never been allowed to drink from, a prop for photographs Nathaniel needed for his investors. She had no car waiting, no coat against the storm, and the security guards flanking the entrance stared at some fixed point past her shoulder, men paid handsomely to develop sudden blindness. Sophia pressed one hand flat against her stomach, feeling her son's frantic movement beneath her palm, and forced herself to stand. The gravel driveway stretched ahead of her into darkness, past fountains Nathaniel had shipped from Florence, past a wrought iron gate stamped with a family crest that had never once, in 4 years of marriage, felt like it belonged to her. She did not know, walking barefoot through the rain because her heels had broken on the marble steps, that 6 miles away her brother Marcus Renard had just hung up a call from a federal auditor who'd spent 11 months quietly building a case against coal industries. She did not know that her other brother, Damien Renard, a man who had turned a single failed startup into a hedge fund managing $8 billion, had spent that very afternoon listening to a nervous investment banker ask uncomfortable questions about the collateral behind Nathaniel's newest luxury tower. She did not know that the 2 brothers who had rebuilt their family's shattered name from nothing after their father's death had ruined it were about to receive the one phone call that would send them tearing across 3 states in the middle of the night. Headlights swept the road behind her and Sophia flinched, certain for one terrible moment that Nathaniel had sent someone to finish what tonight had started. Instead, an old sedan slowed to a stop beside her, its window lowering to reveal a stranger's face, lined with genuine alarm. "Miss, are you hurt? Do you need me to call someone?" Sophia opened her mouth. No sound came out at first, only the rain running down her face indistinguishable now from tears, only the frantic kick of her son reminding her that whatever came next, she could not simply sit down in the mud and let this be where her story ended. She did not yet know that within 48 hours, The empire Nathaniel Cole had built on lies would begin collapsing floor by floor, that the folder of evidence she'd hidden inside a shoebox in her old bedroom for the past 6 months was about to become the most dangerous document in the city, or that her brothers were already coming, and this time, they weren't coming to rescue her. They were coming to burn the whole thing down. The old sedan carried Sophia 3 miles down the rain-slicked road before the driver, a retired nurse named Grace Holloway who had been on her way home from a late shift, insisted on taking her somewhere warm instead of dropping her at the roadside motel Sophia had weakly suggested. It was Grace who found the crumpled napkin in Sophia's coat pocket with her brother Marcus's number scrawled on it in faded ink, a number Sophia hadn't dialed in over a year out of some misplaced loyalty to a marriage that had already died long before that night. It was Grace who dialed it for her when Sophia's hands shook too badly to hold the phone steady. Marcus Renard picked up on the second ring, his voice sharp with the particular alertness of a man who had spent a decade sleeping lightly, waiting for exactly this kind of call. When Grace explained where they were and what had happened, there was a silence on the line so complete that for a moment she thought the call had dropped. Then Marcus said only, "Send me the address," in a tone that made the temperature in the car seem to drop several degrees. He arrived in under 40 minutes, his black SUV pulling into the gas station parking lot where Grace had taken Sophia to wait, its headlights cutting twin beams through the rain. Sophia watched her older brother step out into the storm without an umbrella, without hesitation, and cross the wet pavement toward her with an expression she hadn't seen since their father's funeral 11 years earlier, grief wearing the mask of composure, fury banked low and controlled beneath a surface that gave nothing away. He didn't ask what happened. He simply opened his arms, and Sophia, who had held herself together through hours of humiliation and rain and the long walk down that gravel drive, finally allowed herself to break. "I should have called you months ago," she whispered into his shoulder. "You're calling me now," Marcus said. "That's what matters." He drove her not to a hotel but to the old Renard townhouse on Ashford Street, the one their late father had left them, the one Sophia hadn't set foot inside since her wedding day when she'd walked out of it in white silk believing she was walking toward happiness. The house smelled of dust and old wood polish, but the moment Marcus flipped on the lights in the study, Sophia felt something in her chest loosen for the first time in hours. This had been her father's room once. His law books still lined the shelves, his old desk still sat beneath the window, and above it hung the framed photograph of the 3 Renard siblings as children, arms slung around each other on the lawn of a house that no longer belonged to them. Damien arrived 20 minutes later, having driven straight from a dinner meeting in the city without bothering to change out of his suit, his tie already loosened, his expression carved from granite. He took one look at his sister, the bruise already darkening along her forearm, the exhaustion pooled beneath her eyes, the careful way she held her belly as though protecting the only thing in the room still worth protecting, and something in his controlled financier's composure cracked audibly. "I'm going to kill him," Damien said quietly, which from him was far more alarming than shouting would have been. "You're going to do no such thing," Marcus replied, already pulling a legal pad from the desk drawer, already thinking 3 steps ahead the way he always had, even as children, even when their father used to call him the strategist and Damien the storm. "We're going to do this the right way. The way that ends with him losing everything and never being able to touch her again." Sophia, wrapped in an old blanket Grace had found in a hallway closet before saying her goodbyes and driving off into the night with quiet grace, looked between her brothers and felt, for the first time in years, that she was not alone in a fight she'd been losing silently for a long time. "There's something you both need to see," she said, and the tremor had finally left her voice. "It's in my old bedroom. I hid it there 6 months ago, back when I still thought I could handle this myself." The shoebox was exactly where she'd left it, tucked behind a row of childhood books on the top shelf of her closet, dust settled undisturbed across its lid as though it had been waiting patiently for this exact night. Inside, wrapped in a plastic sleeve to protect it from damp, was a manila folder thick with paper, bank statements showing transfers to shell companies with names that meant nothing until you cross-referenced them against public contracts, photographs of signatures on demolition permits that didn't match the men who supposedly signed them, a flash drive Sophia had copied from Nathaniel's home office computer during a sleepless night 8 months into her pregnancy, when suspicion had finally outweighed loyalty. Damien sat at their father's old desk and began sorting the documents with the ruthless efficiency of a man who read balance sheets the way other people read novels, his jaw tightening with each new page. Marcus stood over his shoulder, occasionally picking up a document, his prosecutor's mind already building a timeline, already identifying which pieces could be used and which needed corroboration before they'd survive a courtroom. "This isn't just fraud," Damien said finally, holding up a bank statement with a number that made even his experienced eyes widen slightly. "This is systemic. He's been laundering development subsidies through fake environmental remediation contracts for at least 3 years. And these signatures, he tapped a permit application, belonged to a city inspector who retired 18 months ago. Someone forged his name to push through a demolition that displaced an entire block of low-income housing on the east side." Sophia felt something cold settle in her stomach that had nothing to do with fear. "The Ridgeline Commons project," she said slowly. "He told investors it was an empty lot. I remember him laughing about it at a dinner party, saying the city practically paid him to knock down a slum." "It wasn't a slum," Marcus said, his voice gone very quiet, the way it always did right before he became truly dangerous. "I remember that case. 43 families were relocated under emergency condemnation orders that never should have qualified. There was an investigation that went nowhere because the paper trail vanished." He looked up at his sister, something sharpening behind his eyes. "The paper trail didn't vanish, Sophia. You had it. You've had it this whole time." Outside, thunder rolled low across the city, and somewhere across town, in the mansion Sophia had just been dragged out of by her hair, Nathaniel Cole was raising a toast to his newly announced engagement, utterly unaware that the woman he'd thrown into the rain like garbage was sitting in her father's old study with the 2 men who had spent a decade rebuilding an empire out of nothing, and who now held in their hands the exact evidence needed to burn his to the ground. "There's more," Sophia said, reaching for one final envelope she'd kept separate, sealed, never opened even by her. "I never had the courage to look at this one. It's from the night Nathaniel came home after our father's old firm collapsed. I always thought it was a coincidence that he started buying up distressed properties right after Dad died. I never let myself ask if it wasn't a coincidence at all." Marcus went very still. Damien set down the papers in his hands. Neither brother reached for the envelope. For a long moment, none of them moved at all, the rain drumming steadily against the windows of a house that had once held their father's secrets, and was about to learn one more. Marcus was the one who finally reached for the envelope, his fingers steady despite the tightness in his jaw. He slid a single sheet of paper free, old and slightly yellowed, dated 11 years earlier, the same month their father, Edmund Renard, had died in what the papers called a single-vehicle accident on a stretch of highway he'd driven 1,000 times without incident. Marcus scanned the page once, then again, his expression shifting from careful control to something Sophia had never seen on her brother's face in all her 30 years of knowing him. "This is a wire authorization," Marcus said slowly, "from Dad's firm's escrow account. $2 million, released the day before he died, to a holding company called Ashgrove Ventures." He looked up, and his voice had gone hoarse. Ashgrove Ventures was the shell company that acquired the Ridgeline block 18 months later. The same shell company in the folder Sophia just gave us. The one Nathaniel's been funneling remediation money through. The room seemed to tilt around Sophia. She had spent 8 months collecting evidence of her husband's corruption, believing she was documenting a businessman's greed, a series of crimes bounded by construction permits and falsified inspections. She had never once let herself consider that the thread might reach backward, past her marriage entirely, into the accident that had shattered her family when she was 19 years old and left 3 siblings to raise themselves in the wreckage of a father's unexplained death. "Dad was investigating something before he died," Damien said, standing now, pacing the length of the study with the barely contained energy of a man who built empires by never sitting still long enough to let fear catch him. "He told me once, months before the accident, that he'd found irregularities in a client's account. He wouldn't tell me who the client was. Said it wasn't safe for me to know yet." He stopped pacing abruptly. "I was 22. I thought he was being dramatic." "He wasn't being dramatic," Marcus said quietly. "Dad was a real estate attorney. If he found a client running shell companies to launder demolition subsidies, and that client's operation later became Ashgrove Ventures. Then Nathaniel didn't marry me because he loved me, Sophia finished, the words coming out flat and strange in her own ears, as though someone else were speaking them. He married me because I was Edmund Renard's daughter. Because it gave him a Renard name to hide behind, and access to whatever files Dad's old firm still held, and a wife too naive to ever look too closely at his business. No one corrected her. The silence in the room confirmed what none of them wanted to say aloud. Sophia pressed both hands to her belly, feeling her son turn restlessly beneath her ribs as though he, too, sensed the ground shifting beneath the family he hadn't yet been born into. 4 years of marriage rearranged themselves in her memory with sickening clarity, the way Nathaniel had pursued her so quickly after her father's funeral, appearing at the memorial service though he'd never met Edmund Renard in life, the way he'd insisted on handling the sale of her father's old firm's remaining assets himself, the way he'd always changed the subject whenever she asked questions about his early business dealings, the decade-old ventures that had somehow, improbably, transformed a struggling contractor into a billionaire developer in under 10 years. "We need to find out who else was involved," Marcus said, already moving toward the desk, already pulling out a fresh legal pad, the prosecutor in him surfacing to keep the grief at bay. If Dad found something, he would have documented it somewhere his firm couldn't touch. He was careful. He always kept a second set of files. "The lake house," Damien said suddenly. He had a safe in the study at the lake house. I remember him showing it to me once when I was a teenager, told me it was for emergencies only. We never opened it after he died because Mom couldn't bear to go back there, and then she passed, and none of us ever. He stopped, swallowing hard. We never went back. Within the hour, despite the storm still raging outside and Sophia's obvious exhaustion, the three of them were in Damien's SUV heading north toward the lake house none of them had set foot in for over a decade, Sophia wrapped in blankets in the back seat, her brothers exchanging tense, clipped sentences in the front as the wipers fought uselessly against the rain. She should have been resting. Marcus said so twice, gently, and both times Sophia shook her head and told him she would not be able to sleep even if she tried, not with her son kicking against her ribs and her father's ghost suddenly standing at the center of everything. The lake house was cold and dust-choked when they finally arrived, moonlight breaking weakly through clouds to illuminate furniture still draped in white sheets, exactly as they'd left it the year their mother died and none of them could bear to return. The study smelled of old paper and neglect. Behind a bookshelf that Damien remembered swung outward on a hidden hinge, they found the safe, a heavy, old-fashioned model, its combination lock cold under Marcus's fingers as he tried the only numbers that made sense, their mother's birthday, then their father's, then, on the third attempt, the date of Sophia's birth. The daughter Edmund Renard had always called his reason for staying honest in a business built on men who weren't. The lock clicked open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth to protect against the damp, was a second folder, thicker than the one Sophia had hidden in her closet, its edges soft with age. Marcus lifted it out with hands that were, for the first time all night, visibly shaking. He opened it under the weak beam of his phone's flashlight, and the three siblings leaned in together, the way they used to lean over homework at their father's kitchen table a lifetime ago, before any of this began. The first page was a letter, handwritten in their father's careful, slanted script, dated 3 days before his death, addressed to no one in particular, as though he'd written it not knowing who would eventually read it, only that someone eventually would. "If you're reading this," Marcus read aloud, his voice breaking on the words, "then something has happened to me, and I need you to understand that it wasn't an accident." Behind them, through the study's rain-streaked window, headlights swept briefly across the gravel drive outside and then vanished into the dark, there and gone so quickly that none of them could say afterward whether they'd truly seen a car at all, or only imagined one, watching them from the tree line at the edge of their father's abandoned lake house. Marcus's voice filled the cold study as he read on, and none of them moved, none of them breathed too loudly, as though the past itself might scatter if they disturbed it. "I have spent 6 months tracing money that should not exist," their father had written. "It moves through companies that own nothing, employ no one, and exist only on paper long enough to make dirty money look clean. I believed, when I began, that I was looking at simple tax fraud committed by a client I no longer respect. I now believe I am looking at something far larger, a pattern of falsified permits, forged inspections, and demolition orders pushed through by bribing city officials, all of it funded by laundered subsidy money meant for genuine remediation of contaminated land. Families have been displaced under false pretenses. I have found at least one inspector's signature forged on 3 separate occasions. I intend to report this to the State Attorney General's office within the week. If I do not survive to do so, know that the man behind it is careful, patient, and has more resources than any single lawyer can outmatch alone. His name is Nathaniel Cole. The name landed in the room like a physical blow. Sophia felt the blood drain from her face, felt Damien's arm come around her shoulders before she even realized her knees had gone weak, and she sank into the old leather chair behind their father's desk, staring at the letter as though it might rearrange itself into something less devastating if she looked hard enough. "He knew," she whispered. "Dad knew who Nathaniel was 11 years before I married him. And somehow Nathaniel found out Dad was building a case against him, and 3 days later, she couldn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. The accident report said no other vehicle was involved," Marcus said, his prosecutor's mind working even through the shock, even through the grief resurfacing raw and fresh as though 11 years had collapsed into a single night. But there was never a full investigation. The case was closed within a week. I remember because I asked the lead detective for updates for months afterward, and he kept telling me there was nothing more to find. His hands tightened on the letter. There was always something more to find. We just didn't have this. Damien was already photographing every page with his phone, his financier's instincts overriding his grief, methodically building a record before anyone could take the physical documents from them. "There's a list here," he said, turning to the second page, "names, dates, dollar amounts. This isn't speculation, Marcus. Dad built the entire case. He just never got to file it." Sophia reached for the final page in the folder, her hands trembling, and found a photograph clipped to the back, her father standing beside a man she didn't immediately recognize, both of them younger, both of them smiling in front of a building she now recognized as Nathaniel's first development, the one that had launched his career 15 years ago. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in her father's handwriting, a single line, "NC and his silent partner, RV, the man who signs nothing and profits from everything." "RV," Damien repeated slowly. "Do we know anyone with those initials?" Before anyone could answer, headlights swept across the window again, closer this time, unmistakably real, tires crunching against wet gravel outside. Marcus was moving before the sound fully registered, crossing to the window and easing the curtain aside just enough to see a black car idling at the end of the long driveway, its headlights extinguished now, engine still running. "Get away from the window," Damien said sharply, already reaching for Sophia, pulling her up from the chair and toward the interior hallway where no windows faced the drive. They stood in the dark hall for nearly 10 minutes, the three of them barely breathing, listening to the low idle of the engine outside, until finally the sound of tires on gravel signaled the car reversing back down the drive and disappearing into the storm. No one had gotten out. No one had approached the house. But someone had known they were there, and that alone told Marcus everything he needed to know about how closely Nathaniel Cole's people had been watching his sister, and for how long. "He's known you had something," Marcus said quietly, once the sound of the engine had fully faded. "That's why he staged tonight the way he did. Public, humiliating, designed to make you look unstable if you ever tried to speak against him. He wanted witnesses to your breakdown before you had the chance to become a threat. Then we don't give him the reaction he's counting on," Sophia said, and something in her voice had changed in the past hour, hardened around the edges the way a wound sometimes hardens into scar tissue stronger than the skin around it. "We don't panic. We don't run. We build the case the way Dad would have built it, carefully, completely, so that when it finally comes out, there's no story he can spin that survives it." Marcus looked at his sister for a long moment, seeing perhaps for the first time that night not the woman who had been dragged down marble steps in the rain, but the daughter of Edmond Renard standing in his study, holding his letter, finishing the sentence violence had cut short 11 years ago. "We'll need everything," he said. The files from Sophia's folder, Dad's files, testimony from anyone Nathaniel's operation has hurt. We do this once, and we do it so thoroughly he never gets the chance to buy his way out. I know where to start, Sophia said. There's a woman named Rosa Ibarra. She lost her home in the Ridgeline demolition. She tried to speak to a reporter about it 2 years ago and the story got killed before it ran. Nathaniel's people threatened her landlord's remaining properties until she stopped talking. Sophia's jaw tightened. I met her once at a charity gala Nathaniel forced me to host for the very foundation that funded her eviction. I didn't understand then what I was looking at. I understand now. Damien was already pulling up flight and driving routes on his phone, calculating the fastest way back into the city before dawn, before Nathaniel's morning headlines could finish painting his wife as an unstable woman abandoned for her own erratic behavior. There's something else, he said, looking up from the screen, his expression grim. I just got a message from my contact at the bank handling Nathaniel's Ridgeline financing. 2 hours ago, right around the time he was throwing you down those steps, Nathaniel authorized an emergency transfer moving $40 million out of the country. Marcus's head snapped up. He's liquidating. He's running, Damien corrected. Which means somehow, somewhere, he already knows we're coming for him, and he's not planning to be here when we arrive. The three of them drove back into the city as the first gray light of dawn broke over the skyline, exhaustion pressing down on all of them like a physical weight, but none of them suggested stopping to rest. Sophia sat in the back seat with her father's letter pressed flat against her folder of evidence, watching the city lights blur past the rain-streaked window, and felt something steady settle into her chest that hadn't been there in years. Not hope exactly, but purpose, sharp and clean as a blade. By the time they reached the Ashford Street townhouse, Marcus had already placed 3 calls, one to a federal prosecutor he'd worked alongside years earlier who now specialized in financial crimes, one to a private investigator who owed him a favor from a case that had quietly saved the man's career, and one to a judge he trusted enough to request an emergency asset freeze before Nathaniel could move another dollar out of the country. Damien, meanwhile, worked his own channels, calling the banker who'd tipped him off about the wire transfer, pressuring 2 nervous investors who'd put money into the Ridgeline development to demand immediate documentation of environmental clearances, and quietly alerting a financial journalist he trusted not to publish prematurely but to be ready the moment the story broke wide open. Sophia's task was harder, and she knew it the moment Marcus suggested it. You need to find Rosa Ibarra, he told her gently. Not us. She trusted you once at that gala, even if she didn't know why she should have. If federal agents show up on her doorstep first, she'll shut down completely. She's been threatened into silence for 2 years. It has to be someone she believes isn't part of the machine that hurt her. Sophia found Rosa's address through an old charity donor list she still had access to, a small apartment on the east side of the city not far, she realized with a sick twist in her stomach, from the empty lot where Rosa's demolished home had once stood. Damien insisted on driving her, waiting outside in the car with the engine running, alert for any sign they were being followed, while Sophia climbed the narrow stairwell alone and knocked on a door with peeling paint. Rosa Ibarra opened it only the width of the chain lock at first, her eyes widening with recognition and then narrowing with suspicion when she saw who stood on her landing. "You're his wife," she said flatly. "I have nothing to say to you." "I'm not his wife anymore," Sophia said, and found that saying it aloud for the first time made it feel truer than it had any right to, only hours after the marriage had technically still existed. "He threw me out last night. I'm pregnant, Rosa, and I'm not protecting him. I'm trying to destroy what he built, and I need your help to do it. I have my father's files. I know what happened to your building wasn't an accident of bureaucracy. I know the inspection was forged." The chain lock rattled, and slowly, the door opened wider. Rosa studied her for a long moment, taking in the bruise darkening along Sophia's forearm, the exhaustion carved into her face, the careful way she cradled her belly as though it were the only solid thing left in her world. "Come in," Rosa said finally. "But if you're lying to me, I'll make sure everyone in this building knows exactly who you married." 2 hours later, Sophia left the apartment with a recorded statement, copies of Rosa's own documentation, Photographs of condemnation notices dated after the demolition had already begun, receipts for a relocation payment that never arrived, and the names of 4 other families willing to speak if Rosa spoke first. It was, Marcus told her when she returned, exactly the kind of corroborating testimony that transformed a paper trail into an unassailable case. By midday, the story Nathaniel Cole had been counting on to define the narrative had already begun collapsing under its own weight. He'd released a statement to select press outlets that morning describing his wife as emotionally unwell and citing concerns about her mental stability during a difficult pregnancy as the reason for their separation, a statement clearly crafted to preempt exactly the kind of accusations she might bring against him. But the statement had gone out before he'd known about the asset freeze Marcus's judge had granted by 10 a.m., before he'd known that a financial journalist was already fielding calls from 3 separate sources about irregularities in Ridgeline's environmental permits, before he'd known that Rosa Ibarra had spent the morning on the phone with a federal investigator, finally unburdening 2 years of silence. Sophia watched it happen from the study on Ashford Street, exhausted but unwilling to sleep, refreshing a financial news site every few minutes as small cracks began appearing in Nathaniel's public armor. A minor headline first, questions raised about coal industry's Ridgeline financing. Then a larger one an hour later, as the asset freeze became public record, coal industry's assets frozen amid fraud investigation. By early evening, 2 of his primary investors had issued statements distancing themselves from the development entirely, citing concerns about compliance irregularities, corporate language for the same panicked retreat Sophia had watched consume dinner parties whenever a scandal touched anyone near her former social circle. It was nearly 9 that evening when Nathaniel finally called her directly, his name flashing on the burner phone Damien had given her that morning, the number known only to a handful of people. Sophia stared at the screen for 3 rings before answering, Marcus and Damien both leaning in to listen. "You have no idea what you've done," Nathaniel said, and for the first time in 4 years of marriage, Sophia heard something underneath his usual cold control, panic, thin and unmistakable, straining the edges of his voice. "Whatever you think you have, whatever fantasy your brothers have filled your head with, it won't hold up. I have lawyers who will bury you in litigation for the next decade. I have relationships with people you can't begin to imagine." "You had those things yesterday," Sophia said, and her voice came out steadier than she'd expected, steadier than she felt. "Today you have a federal fraud investigation, 2 investors publicly distancing themselves from you, and a woman named Rosa Ibarra telling the truth for the first time in 2 years about what really happened to her home. Tomorrow, Nathaniel, you're going to have considerably less than that." The silence on the line stretched long enough that she wondered if he'd hung up. When he finally spoke again, his voice had dropped to something quiet and genuinely frightening, a register she'd heard only once before, the night he'd canceled her hospital insurance without warning simply to prove he could. "You should be more careful," he said, "about what you think you know regarding your father's accident. Some questions, Sophia, are better left buried with the people who asked them first." The line went dead. Sophia stood frozen with the phone still pressed to her ear, the color draining from her face, and across the room she watched her brother's expressions shift from cautious hope to something colder and far more dangerous, the unmistakable look of 2 men who had just heard, for the first time from Nathaniel's own mouth, an admission neither of them had dared say aloud. For a long moment, no one in the study spoke. The rain had finally stopped outside, leaving only the faint drip of water from the eaves and the low hum of the desk lamp. And into that silence Marcus finally said the words all 3 of them had been circling for hours without daring to land on them directly. "That was a confession," he said quietly. He just told her, in as many words as a man like that would ever allow himself, that he had our father killed. Damien was already pacing again, his phone forgotten in his hand, his jaw working with a fury he was visibly struggling to keep contained. "We can't use it," he said bitterly. "A phone call with no recording, no witness beyond the 3 of us, worthless in any courtroom that matters. He knows that. That's exactly why he said it." "He said it because he's unraveling," Sophia countered, surprising even herself with the steadiness in her voice. A careful man doesn't threaten his pregnant estranged wife with the truth about her father's murder unless he's already lost control of the narrative he built his entire life around. He's not thinking clearly anymore, Damien. That's not strength. That's the sound of a man who knows the walls are closing in. Marcus moved to the desk, pulling out his phone, and dialed a number Sophia didn't recognize. When the call connected, his voice took on the crisp, official cadence she remembered from childhood, back when their father used to bring important calls into his study and close the door, leaving his children to imagine the weighty matters being decided behind it. Agent Whitfield, it's Marcus Renard. I need to report a direct threat made against a material witness in an active federal investigation, and I have reason to believe it connects to an unsolved fatality from 11 years ago that I'd like reopened. The wheels that had begun turning slowly that morning began, over the following 24 hours, to turn with terrifying speed. Agent Whitfield, it turned out, had already been quietly building a file on Nathaniel Cole for the better part of 8 months, working a thread that had started with a whistleblower at a permitting office and gone cold for lack of corroborating evidence. Evidence that Sophia's shoebox and her father's lake house safe had just supplied in devastating abundance. By the following afternoon, federal agents had executed a search warrant on Cole Industries headquarters, seizing servers, financial records, and a set of internal communications that painted a portrait far uglier than even Sophia had imagined, spanning not just the Ridgeline demolition but a pattern stretching back 15 years, touching 6 separate developments across 3 states, each one funded by the same laundering scheme her father had begun tracing before his death. Nathaniel, for his part, did not go quietly. He held a press conference on the steps of his headquarters that same afternoon, flanked by lawyers, insisting the investigation was a coordinated smear campaign orchestrated by a bitter, financially motivated family seeking to seize control of his company through his estranged, unstable wife. He wore his most practiced expression of wounded dignity, the one Sophia recognized instantly from 100 charity galas, and for a moment, watching the broadcast from the study on Ashford Street, she felt an old, familiar flicker of doubt, the same instinct that had kept her silent for 4 years, the fear that no one would believe her over a man so polished, so convincing, so utterly certain of his own innocence. Then the cameras cut to Vivian Cross's Instagram account, and Sophia watched the flicker of doubt curdle into something closer to grim satisfaction. Vivian, it seemed, had spent the previous 24 hours watching her future collapse in real time along with Nathaniel's fortune, and had apparently decided self-preservation mattered more than loyalty to a man who could no longer guarantee her the lifestyle she'd been promised. She had posted and swiftly deleted a photo from months earlier, herself and Nathaniel at what was unmistakably the Ridgeline site before demolition, captioned at the time with a laughing comment about clearing out the eyesores before the money moves in. Someone had screenshotted it before deletion, and by evening, it had spread across every financial and gossip account covering the story, undermining Nathaniel's carefully staged press conference more effectively than anything Marcus's federal contacts could have produced. By that evening, Vivian herself called Sophia directly, her voice tight and uncharacteristically small compared to the smug confidence Sophia remembered from the top of the marble staircase 2 nights earlier. I didn't know what he was actually doing, Vivian said, though Sophia noted she didn't bother denying she'd known something. He told me the demolitions were legal, that the families had all been fairly compensated. I need you to know I'm cooperating with the investigators. I gave them everything, texts, emails, financial records he thought I didn't have access to. Why? Sophia asked, genuinely curious despite herself. Because he already told his lawyers he's planning to say I orchestrated the laundering scheme to protect himself, Vivian said, bitterness breaking through the practiced smoothness. He's willing to let me take the fall for a company I never had a single share in. I'm not going to prison so Nathaniel Cole can keep his freedom. It wasn't loyalty. It wasn't remorse, not entirely. But it was, Sophia realized, exactly the kind of self-interested betrayal that would prove devastating in Nathaniel's defense, and by the following morning, when federal prosecutors formally charged Nathaniel Cole with wire fraud, money laundering, and bribery of a public official, Vivian's cooperation agreement was cited prominently in the indictment as a key source of corroborating evidence. Sophia sat in Marcus's study reading the indictment as it was released publicly, 41 pages of careful legal language that transformed 4 years of quiet suffering and 11 years of unresolved grief into something concrete, something the law could finally hold accountable. Her hands trembled as she reached the final page, where a single line stopped her breath entirely. The government further notes ongoing investigation into the 2013 death of Edmund Renard, whose files initiated the financial trail central to this indictment. They were reopening her father's case. Officially. Publicly. After 11 years of silence, someone with real power was finally asking the question her family had been forced to swallow at his funeral. Marcus found her still staring at the screen 20 minutes later, and when he sat beside her, he didn't offer words of comfort, only his presence, steady and quiet, the way their father used to sit with them after nightmares when they were small. "He can't touch us anymore," Marcus said finally. "Whatever happens now, Sophia, he can't touch any of us anymore." That was when Sophia's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number, 3 words that turned her blood to ice water in her veins. "I'm not done." Below the message, a photograph loaded slowly on the screen. A picture of the nursery she and Nathaniel had prepared together months earlier, back before the mask had fully slipped, taken from outside the window of the estate she'd been dragged out of 2 nights before. The curtains, she realized with mounting horror, had been moved since she'd left. Someone was still inside the house. The photograph sent Damien across the room to Sophia's side before she'd even finished processing what she was looking at, and Marcus was already dialing Agent Whitfield again, his voice clipped and urgent in a way she'd rarely heard from her usually measured brother. Within minutes, federal agents were dispatched to the Cole estate. Though everyone in the room understood the delay might already be too long, Nathaniel had spent 2 decades learning how to disappear evidence at the first sign of trouble, and a nursery photograph suggested he was no longer thinking about evidence at all, but about something far more personal. "He can't get to us here," Damien said, though his hand had already moved to the study's window, checking the street below with the same wary alertness he'd shown at the lake house 2 nights earlier. "He doesn't need to get to us," Marcus said grimly, ending his call. "He needs one more card to play before this ends, something to make us hesitate, something to slow the case down long enough for his lawyers to negotiate a deal instead of a conviction. This is exactly what a cornered man does, Damien. He doesn't attack. He threatens the thing you can't risk losing." Sophia pressed a hand to her belly, feeling her son shift restlessly beneath her palm as though he too sensed the tension gathering in the room, and made a decision that surprised even herself in its steadiness. "Then we don't give him the fear he's trying to buy," she said. "We go public. All of it. Today. Not just the indictment, the letter, Rosa's testimony, everything. If the whole story is already out there, threatening me accomplishes nothing for him except one more charge added to the pile." Marcus studied his sister for a long moment, and Sophia watched something shift in his expression, an old-fashioned kind of pride their father used to wear whenever one of them argued a point well. "That's exactly what Dad would have done," he said quietly. "Meet the threat with daylight instead of silence." By that afternoon, the financial journalist Damien had quietly briefed days earlier published a sweeping exposé combining the federal indictment with exclusive interviews. Rosa Ibarra speaking on the record for the first time in 2 years, 3 other displaced families corroborating her account, and, most devastatingly, excerpts from Edmund Renard's 11-year-old letter. Its handwriting reproduced alongside a photograph of the man himself, transforming an old, quietly closed accident case into what every major outlet in the city was now calling a probable homicide connected to one of the largest financial fraud schemes the state had prosecuted in a decade. Sophia watched the story detonate across every screen in the study, watched Nathaniel's name trend alongside words like fraud, murder investigation, and collapse, and felt something in her chest finally begin to loosen after 4 years of carrying a secret she hadn't even fully understood she'd been carrying. This was not vengeance exactly. It was closer to what her father had written in that unfinished letter. The simple, stubborn insistence that the truth deserved to exist in the world whether or not it was convenient for the people it implicated. Nathaniel was arrested outside a private airfield 3 hours later, having attempted, exactly as Damien predicted, to board a chartered jet under a name that wasn't his own, carrying 2 passports and a briefcase federal agents later confirmed held over $400,000 in cash. The footage aired that evening on every local news broadcast. Nathaniel Cole, stripped of his tailored composure, being led in handcuffs across a rain-slicked tarmac, his face for once betraying something other than the careful, practiced confidence he'd worn like armor for as long as Sophia had known him. Vivian's cooperation, combined with the financial records seized from Cole Industries servers and the corroborating testimony from Rosa Ibarra's community, built a case so thoroughly documented that Nathaniel's own attorneys reportedly urged him within days to consider a plea deal rather than risk trial. He refused, still convinced, even in custody, that his name and his money would eventually buy him a path out of consequences the way it always had before. Marcus, watching the case unfold from what had become an almost daily briefing with Agent Whitfield's office, doubted it would work this time. The evidence was simply too complete, the human cost too well documented, the paper trail too directly connected to a decade-old death that a grand jury had now formally agreed deserved a homicide investigation. 3 weeks after the arrest, Sophia went into labor on a quiet Tuesday morning, 6 days before her due date, in the same Ashford Street townhouse where she'd first broken down in her brother's arms after the rain. Marcus and Damien sat in the hospital waiting room for 11 hours, Marcus reviewing case files to keep his hands busy, Damien pacing a groove into the linoleum floor, both of them looking up sharply every time a nurse passed through the double doors, until finally, near midnight, a doctor emerged to tell them they had a nephew. Sophia named him Edmund, after the grandfather he would never meet but whose stubborn insistence on the truth had ultimately saved his mother's life, and Marcus, when she finally allowed him into the room to meet the boy, held his nephew with a careful, reverent gentleness that made Sophia's throat tighten with an emotion too large for words. Damien, typically unshakable in every boardroom he'd ever commanded, cried openly at the sight of the small, furious, red-faced infant who represented, in some undeniable way, the family's continuation past everything that had tried to end it. It was in the hospital room 2 days later, exhausted but finally, genuinely at peace for the first time in longer than she could remember, that Sophia received the final piece of news that closed the loop her father had opened 11 years earlier. Agent Whitfield called Marcus directly with confirmation that forensic reconstruction of the original accident scene, combined with testimony from a mechanic who had been paid to falsify a brake inspection report the week before Edmund Renard's death, had produced enough evidence to formally reclassify the case. It was no longer an accident. It was murder, ordered, the evidence strongly suggested, by the same man now sitting in a federal detention facility awaiting trial on 23 separate counts, a man who had once believed a family broken by grief would never be dangerous enough to notice, let alone dismantle, everything he'd built on their father's silence. The trial began 4 months later, in early spring, when Sophia's son had grown sturdy enough to lift his head and fix his dark, curious eyes on whoever held him, a small, unbothered witness to a story he would only understand fully many years from now. Sophia sat in the courtroom gallery every day the proceedings allowed her, Edmund sometimes on her lap when Marcus's schedule permitted, sometimes left with Damien's assistant in the hallway outside when the testimony grew too graphic for a child's presence, and she watched, day after day, as the case her father had begun building 11 years earlier was finally, meticulously laid bare before a jury of 12 strangers who had no reason to disbelieve any of it. Rosa Ibarra testified on the 4th day, her voice steady despite 2 years of enforced silence, finally breaking in a room full of strangers, describing the morning bulldozers arrived at her building before the legal appeal period had even closed, describing the relocation payment that never came, describing the threats made against her landlord when she tried to speak to a reporter. 3 other displaced families followed her, each testimony adding another brick to a wall of evidence Nathaniel's defense attorneys grew visibly less confident attempting to scale. The mechanic who had falsified Edmund Renard's brake inspection took the stand on the 9th day, his testimony halting and shame-riddled, describing a cash payment delivered by a man he could only partially identify, a payment he'd accepted 11 years earlier and had lived with the guilt of every day since. Vivian testified on the 11th day, composed and precise in a way that surprised Sophia, walking the jury through recorded conversations, forwarded emails, financial documents Nathaniel had never imagined she'd secretly copied. She did not perform contrition for the courtroom, did not pretend to virtues she hadn't possessed, simply laid out the truth as she'd witnessed it with the flat, unadorned honesty of someone who had run out of reasons to protect a man who'd been willing to sacrifice her the moment it became convenient. Sophia herself testified on the 14th day, and though her hands trembled as she took the oath, her voice did not waver once through 3 hours of testimony, walking the jury through 4 years of marriage built on a lie neither she nor her father could have fully imagined at its beginning, through the night she'd been thrown down marble steps in front of 200 witnesses who had done nothing to help her, through the shoebox in her closet and the safe in the lake house study and the letter her father had written 3 days before his death, not knowing who would eventually read it, only that someone eventually would. Nathaniel watched her testify from the defense table without expression, the careful, practiced composure he'd worn through every public appearance for 2 decades finally beginning to look less like control and more like a mask stretched too thin over something hollow beneath it. He did not testify in his own defense. His attorneys, in the end, could find no version of events that survived cross-examination against the weight of what the prosecution had assembled, and on the 17th day of trial, after only 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned a verdict on all 23 counts. Guilty. Sophia sat perfectly still as the verdicts were read aloud, one after another: wire fraud, money laundering, bribery of a public official, and finally, on the last and gravest charge, murder in the first degree, related to the death of Edmund Renard 11 years earlier. She did not cry. She did not feel the surge of triumph she might have expected, watching the man who had thrown her down marble steps in the rain finally hear the word guilty attached to his name in a room full of people who had believed her. What she felt instead, watching federal marshals lead Nathaniel Cole from the courtroom for the last time as a free man, was something quieter and more permanent. The sensation of a door finally, completely closing on a chapter of her life she would no longer need to carry alone. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the steps, but Sophia did not stop to speak to them. Marcus and Damien flanked her on either side, exactly as they had on the night everything began, and together the three of them walked past the cameras toward the car waiting at the curb, Edmund asleep against his mother's shoulder, entirely unaware of the storm his existence had helped weather. The following spring, on a warm afternoon a year almost to the day since the rain-soaked night that had changed everything, Sophia stood in the small garden behind the Ashford Street townhouse, watching her son take his first unsteady steps across the grass toward his uncles, who knelt on either side of him with their arms outstretched, laughing, competing without shame for the honor of catching him first. The house had been renovated over the past year, its study cleared of dust sheets, its shelves reorganized to hold not just Edmund Renard's old law books but the growing collection of case files Marcus now consulted regularly, having left his previous firm to open a practice dedicated to exactly the kind of families Rosa Ibarra represented. People the system too often failed until someone with resources and stubbornness decided to fight for them properly. Damien had redirected a portion of his fund toward transparent, community-vetted development projects, partnering, somewhat to his own surprise, with Rosa herself, who now sat on an advisory board ensuring no development moved forward without genuine consent from the neighborhoods it touched. It wasn't atonement, exactly, none of them believed money could fully repay what had been taken from families like hers, but it was, as their father had once written in a letter meant for no one and everyone, the simple, stubborn insistence that the truth deserved to matter, and that those who profited from its absence should be made to answer for it. Sophia knelt in the grass as her son took his final wobbling steps into Damien's waiting arms, his delighted laughter carrying across the garden, and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the quiet, complete absence of fear. Nathaniel Cole would spend the remainder of his life behind federal walls, his empire dismantled piece by piece and redistributed to the very communities he'd once destroyed for profit. Her father's name had been restored, his death finally understood, his unfinished letter published in full as part of the public record, ensuring that anyone who searched his name would find not a quiet accident but the truth he had died trying to tell. The reign that had once seemed like the end of everything had only been the beginning. Sophia understood now, watching her son reach for her, watching her brothers rise to stand beside her in the golden afternoon light. Every door Nathaniel had thrown her through, believing he was casting her out into ruin, had only led her home.